My name is Julia. Before you hear anything else, I need you to know that. And if you've ever had your work, your ideas, your very soul stolen from you in a brightly lit office that felt more like a tomb, then do me a favor, like this video. Leave a comment. Let me know I'm not just screaming into the void. It helps to know you're not alone in the dark. For 2 years, I was a ghost. Not the kind that rattles chains, but the kind that builds empires for other people to live in. I was the junior ghostwriter for Autumn Vance, the star architect at Helios Design, a firm so prestigious its name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones at cocktail parties I was never invited to. Autumn was the face, the name, the brand. She had the perfect haircut, the razor-sharp suits, and a smile that could sell a condemned warehouse as a luxury loft. I was the engine. I was the one hunched over a glowing screen at 3 in the morning, mainlining stale coffee, pulling structural miracles out of thin air. I was the one whose concepts she would present in boardrooms, her voice smooth and confident, while I was back at the office, relegated to the shadows, because as she so often reminded me, I lacked the polish to meet with clients. She said it with a placid, almost motherly kindness that made it sting even more. It wasn't an insult, she'd imply, just a simple statement of fact, like saying the sky was blue. The breaking point wasn't a slow erosion, it was an earthquake. It was the night she won the National Architects Guild Award for the Athelgard Tower. My tower. I had sketched its initial, impossible form on a cocktail napkin during a lonely dinner. I had solved its cantilevering crisis by studying the bone structure of a falcon's wing. I had built the entire digital model, beam by agonizing beam. I had lived and breathed that building for 14 months. It was more mine than my own apartment. That night, at the gala, I stood at the back of the ballroom, squeezed between a potted fern and a catering station. I wore my one good dress, the one I'd bought for a wedding a few years prior. Autumn was a supernova on stage, bathed in golden light, holding the gleaming geometric award. My award. She thanked the partners. She thanked the city council. She thanked her parents for believing in her. She even thanked her assistant for remembering to charge her phone. My name was a ghost. An unuttered word in a room full of applause. Just before she'd gone up, she had glided past me, a whisper of expensive perfume in her wake. She'd placed a cool manicured hand on my arm, her rings digging slightly into my skin. She'd smiled that placid smile. "You have the talent, darling," she'd murmured, her voice a silken thread of condescension, "but not the polish. One day, maybe, you'll get there." Then she turned and walked toward the stage, toward my glory, leaving me in the dimness with the scent of wilting canapés and my own evaporating worth. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, my heart a cold, dense stone in my chest, and I made a decision. I quit the next day, a one-line email, no explanation, no dramatic exit. I just vanished. I took my talent, my late nights, my so-called lack of polish, and I started my own small, independent consultancy. A tiny one-woman operation out of my spare bedroom. A year passed. A year of struggle, of ramen noodles, of near failures, of small hard-won victories. And then the industry's most coveted prize, the Sterling Arch, announced its jury for the year. They were adding a new, anonymous juror, selected, the press release said, for their fresh, groundbreaking perspective. When Autumn Vance, at the peak of her power, submitted her latest masterpiece for consideration, she had no idea she was submitting it to me. And now, here I am. I'm sitting in my own office now, a quiet space that smells of concrete and fresh brewed coffee. The sun is streaming through a window that I designed. In front of me is Autumn's proposal. It's thick, glossy, and reeks of overconfidence. And in my hand, I'm holding a red pen, the kind architects use to bleed all over a flawed design. I am the anonymous juror. I am the ghost she thought she'd vanquished. And this little red pen will decide if Autumn Vance ever works in this city again. It wasn't about revenge. It was about gravity. And she was about to learn that what goes up must, eventually, come down. The night of the gala, after the last champagne flute had been cleared, and the applause had faded into the city's hum, I didn't go home. I couldn't face the sympathetic quiet of my apartment, the four walls that knew exactly how many hours I had poured into a triumph that wasn't mine. Instead, I took a cab back to the office. The security guard, a kind old man named Arthur, who always saved me the last donut, nodded at me with tired eyes. "Long night, Miss Julia." The longest, Arthur. I let myself into the vast, cavernous space of Helios Design. It was silent, a hollowed-out whale skeleton under the ghostly glow of the emergency lights. My footsteps echoed on the polished concrete floors. This was the cathedral of Autumn's success, and I was the one who had laid every stone, yet I was forced to pray at the back. I walked to my desk, a small, unassuming island in a sea of identical workstations. It was a stupid IKEA desk, the kind you get for your first apartment, a stark contrast to the custom-built mahogany behemoth in Autumn's glass-walled office. But this small, particle-board rectangle was where the magic happened. This was the forge. I sank into my chair, the cheap casters groaning in protest. The screen of my computer was asleep, a black mirror reflecting a distorted, exhausted version of me. I didn't turn it on. I didn't need to. The ghost of the Athelgard Tower's blueprints was burned onto the back of my eyelids. I could see every line, every measurement, every notation. I saw the late-night simulations, the frantic calculations when the wind shear analysis came back all wrong. I saw the moment of breakthrough, at 4 in the morning, when I realized the problem wasn't the structure, but the skin, and devised the double helix facade that both stabilized the core and gave the building its iconic twisting form. Autumn had presented that solution the next day as a moment of sudden inspiration she'd had while jogging. The partners had eaten it up. My breakdown wasn't loud. It was a quiet, internal collapse. A single, hot tear traced a path through the foundation I was wearing. A foundation I'd put on to look polished for an event where I was treated like furniture. The silence of the office was deafening. It was filled with the ghosts of my own words, my own ideas, all attributed to another. I leaned forward, my forehead resting on the cool, unforgiving surface of the desk. The faint smell of ozone from the servers and the chemical tang of cleaning supplies filled my nostrils. This was the real smell of success, not champagne and perfume. It was the smell of erasure. It wasn't just the Athelgard Tower. My mind, now untethered from the immediate task of survival, began to rewind, to play back the highlight reel of my own invisibility. It started small, as these things always do. My first project at Helios was a simple residential renovation. I'd found a clever way to reconfigure a load-bearing wall to create an open-plan living space the client desperately wanted, something the senior architect had said was impossible. I drew it up, excited, proud. I showed it to Autumn. She'd looked at it, a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, in her eyes before her placid mask slipped back into place. "That's a good start, Julia," she'd said, taking the sketch. "Let me see what I can do with it." The next week, in the client meeting, she presented my exact design, my lines, my solution. When the client praised its ingenuity, Autumn had simply smiled and said, "We have a very collaborative environment here." I felt a hot flush of indignation, but I said nothing. I was new, I was junior. I told myself it was a team effort, just like she said. That was the first cut. Then came the Moreau Center competition, a career-making project. The brief was to design a sustainable cultural center on a difficult, oddly shaped plot of land. I went deep. I spent weeks researching biomimicry, looking at how nature solves complex spatial problems. The idea came to me not at my desk, but in a botanical garden, staring at the intricate, overlapping structure of a giant lily pad. I developed a concept for a building with a modular, lily pad-like roof system that could collect rainwater, generate solar power, and create a stunning, dappled light effect in the atrium below. It was radical, it was beautiful, and it was mine. I worked for 72 hours straight, building the presentation, the models, the data. I was vibrating with a mixture of caffeine and creative fire. The morning of the presentation, I was ready. I had my notes. I had practiced my speech. Autumn walked into my workspace, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to me. She looked at my suit, a perfectly respectable, if not designer, navy blue. "Julia, darling," she'd said, her voice gentle, "you've done incredible work, truly, but this client, they're old money. They need to see a certain gravitas, a certain polish. Let me handle the room. You're the brilliant mind, I'm the face. We're a team." I felt my throat tighten. The word team had started to sound like a cage. I sat at my desk, my coffee growing cold, while she went into the main conference room and won the competition with my lily pads. It was during that project that I met Leo. He was a summer intern, barely 20, with eyes full of the kind of earnest passion for architecture I was starting to lose. He was brilliant, a savant with drafting software, but clumsy and nervous. He reminded me of myself. One afternoon, Autumn was on a rampage. A minor formatting error on a client-facing document had sent her into a controlled, icy rage. She was dressing Leo down in the middle of the open plan office, her voice low but carrying, each word a precisely aimed dart. I saw the color drain from Leo's face, the way he seemed to shrink into his chair. I stood up and walked over. "I'm sorry, Renim," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering. That was my fault. I was reviewing his work, and I should have caught it. I'll fix it immediately. Autumn's cold gaze shifted to me. Her eyes narrowed. "Don't coddle the interns, Julia," she'd said. "They need to learn that in the real world, mistakes have consequences." She'd swept away, leaving a chill in her wake. Leo had looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," he'd whispered. I'd just given him a small smile. "We're a team, right?" From that day on, Leo was my guy. He'd bring me coffee without being asked. He'd flag potential issues in my drafts before they became problems. A quiet, loyal soldier in my lonely trench. The flashbacks kept coming, each one another layer of insulation around the cold resolve forming in my gut. I remembered the endless nights, the canceled dates, the holidays I'd worked through. I remembered Autumn calling me on a Saturday morning, while I was at my own father's funeral, asking for a specific file number, not even bothering to ask why I wasn't at the office. I had given it to her. I had apologized for not being there. The memory made me feel sick. What was I thinking? Why did I let it go on for so long? The question hangs in the air. Even now, it's easy to judge from the outside, to say you would have stormed out, you would have fought back. But when you're inside the machine, it's different. There was a part of me, a deeply insecure part, that believed her. I believed I didn't have the polish. I was a builder, a maker, not a seller. I told myself I was learning from a master, that paying my dues meant letting her take the credit. It was a form of professional Stockholm syndrome. I had become loyal to my captor, the steady paycheck, the prestige of the firm's name on my resume. It was all a powerful anesthetic, numbing me to the slow, methodical theft of my own career. It's a debatable logic, I know. It's the kind of choice that people pick apart, saying I was weak, but fear and a desperate need for validation make you do illogical things. Sitting there in the echoing darkness of the office, the weight of those 2 years pressed down on me, a physical force. I felt hollowed out, a beautifully designed building, with nothing inside. The single tear had dried on my cheek. There were no more. The grief was hardening into something else, something cold and sharp. My phone, lying face down on the desk, vibrated. The screen lit up the darkness. It was an email notification. I almost ignored it, but the sender's name caught my eye. Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a legend. A semi-retired architect, the kind of purist who still sketched with charcoal and spoke about buildings as if they were living things. He'd been a consultant on one of our projects a year ago, a difficult museum extension. He and I had connected instantly, spending hours debating the merits of different joinery techniques and the philosophical implications of a cantilever. Autumn had been dismissive of him, calling him a dinosaur. But Marcus had seen something in me. I remembered our last meeting on that project. He'd cornered me by the coffee machine. "Autumn is a fantastic salesperson," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "But you, Julia, you're an architect. Your voice is the one that matters on this project. Don't ever let anyone else convince you otherwise." It was the first time anyone of his stature had validated my work, my actual work, not the polished version Autumn presented. His words had been a small warm coal I had kept glowing in the back of my mind. I opened the email. It was short and simple. Subject: Athelgard Tower, Julia. "I was at the gala tonight. I saw the building, and I saw you at the back of the room. It has your voice. It's magnificent. Whatever you do next, the world will be listening. Regards, Marcus." And that was it. That was the catalyst. The external validation I didn't even know I was starving for. It was like a splash of cold water to the face. The world will be listening, but they couldn't listen if I didn't have a voice. They couldn't listen if I stayed in the shadows, letting Autumn speak for me. The anger, when it finally came, wasn't hot. It was arctic, a cold, clear, diamond-hard resolve. It wasn't about revenge, not then. It was about reclamation. It was about survival. I swiveled in my chair, the groan of the casters a sound of decision. I tapped my keyboard and the monitor flickered to life. illuminating my face in its pale blue light. I opened my email client. I composed a new message. To Autumn Vance. Subject, resignation. The cursor blinked on the blank page. A steady, rhythmic heartbeat. I thought about all the things I could write, the accusations, the pain, the list of my stolen work, but I knew it would be pointless. She would dismiss it as hysteria, as a lack of professionalism, as a lack of polish, so I wrote only 2 words. I quit. I hit send. The email vanished into the digital ether. No call, no meeting, no thank you. I stood up. I didn't take anything from my desk, not the photos, not the stress ball, not the mug my sister had given me. They belonged to the ghost, and I was done being a ghost. I walked out of Helios Design for the last time, my footsteps no longer echoing, but silent and purposeful. I was walking into the unknown, with no plan, no savings to speak of, and nothing but the quiet conviction of my own talent. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt like I could breathe. The year that followed my departure was a lesson in humility and grit. I named my consultancy, Axis Mundi Design, a concept in mythology that refers to the center of the world, the connection between heaven and earth. It was a deliberately grand name for an operation that consisted of me, my laptop, and a spare bedroom that still smelled faintly of my roommate's departed cat. The first few months were brutal. The prestige of having Helios Design on my resume meant nothing when I was a lone freelancer. Big firms saw me as a flight risk, small firms saw me as a threat. Potential clients wanted to see a portfolio of finished, built work under my own name, but all my best work had Autumn's name plastered all over it. It was a cruel catch-22. I was an architect with a portfolio I couldn't claim. I survived on scraps. A kitchen remodel for a friend of a friend, a garage conversion. I poured the same level of intensity and creativity into designing a new bathroom vanity as I had into the Athelgard Tower. It wasn't about the scale, it was about the integrity of the work. It wasn't a grand, vengeful plan, it was just work. I told myself over and over that this wasn't about getting back at Autumn, it was about building something for myself. The repetition was a mantra, a way to keep the bitterness from poisoning the well of my creativity. About 3 months in, I got a tentative email from a dummy address. The message was short, "Are you okay?" I knew instantly it was from Leo. I wrote back, "I'm surviving. You?" This began a slow clandestine correspondence. He became my periscope, my one pair of eyes inside my old life. He told me things were chaotic at Helios. Autumn had tried to replace me with 2 junior architects, but couldn't manage them. She had the ideas, he said, but no one could translate her vague, grandiose statements into actual buildable plans. Projects were stalling, deadlines were being missed. He told me about a meeting where she'd tried to explain a complex structural concept using a metaphor about a sad ballerina that left the engineers completely baffled. Apparently my coddling of the junior staff had actually been mentoring, and without me as a buffer and a translator, her abrasive style was causing a quiet exodus of talent. Every email from Leo was a small, satisfying confirmation that I hadn't been a ghost. I had been the foundation, and now, cracks were starting to show in the facade. My real leverage, the thing I was slowly, methodically building, wasn't a network of spies or a file of stolen documents. It was my own intellectual property. During my time at Helios, to keep my sanity, I had filled a dozen black moleskine notebooks. They were part journal, part sketchbook, part engineering manual. In them I had developed and refined a personal design philosophy, a methodology I called the kintsugi method. It was named after the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold lacquer, making the cracks the most beautiful part of the object. My architectural version of this was to approach a project not by hiding its flaws or limitations, a difficult site, a tight budget, a restrictive zoning law, but by making those flaws the central defining feature of the design. It was about finding strength and beauty in the constraints. It was the philosophy that had secretly underpinned all my best work at Helios, including the Athelgard Tower, which had to be built on a ridiculously narrow, geologically unstable plot of land. Autumn had always dismissed my notebooks as Julia's little diaries. She didn't understand that they weren't diaries, they were the source code. Now on my own, I started to externalize it. I wasn't going to let my philosophy remain a secret. I started a blog. I wrote long, dense articles about the kintsugi method, illustrated with my own sketches from past unbuilt concepts. I took the scraps of projects I was getting and applied the method with a fanatical devotion, documenting every step. I designed a small community garden pavilion around a massive, unmovable boulder, making the rock the heart of the structure instead of an obstacle. I redesigned a cramped apartment by using the ugly, exposed plumbing as a dramatic industrial design element, painting it copper and making it a feature. I was building a public identity around the very soul of my work, the part of me that was unstealable. This, I now realize, was my first act of defiance. It was a quiet, academic declaration of independence. Then came the call that changed everything. It was Marcus Thorne. He'd been following my blog. He loved the kintsugi method. He called it honest architecture. He had a project, he said. It was small, something the big firms wouldn't touch. The restoration of the old St. Jude's Maritime Chapel, a historic little building on the waterfront that had been ravaged by a storm. It was a wreck. The budget was razor thin. It was, by all accounts, an impossible job. It was perfect. I poured everything I had into that chapel. I used the storm damage as my guide. A collapsed wall became a massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out onto the sea. Water-stained wood was carefully preserved and sealed, its patterns telling the story of the building's life. I used salvaged materials from the wreckage to build the new pews and altar. When it was finished, it wasn't just restored, it was reborn. It was a space that felt both ancient and modern, a testament to resilience. It didn't get a feature in the big, glossy magazines, but it got something better. A long, thoughtful review in Architect, a small but incredibly influential journal for architectural theorists. The reviewer praised the building's profound dialogue with its own history with trauma, and specifically named my kintsugi method as a revolutionary approach to adaptive reuse. That article was a flare shot into the night. It put my tiny one-woman firm on a very specific, very important map. It was read by academics, by purists, by the kind of people who sit on award juries. I started getting calls, not for kitchen remodels, but for consultations, for guest lectures at universities. I was no longer a ghost. I was a thinker, an emerging voice. 6 months later, the email arrived. It was from the Sterling Arch Foundation. My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. I was sure it was a request for a donation, but it wasn't. They wrote that in their yearly review, the board had decided to shake things up. For decades, the jury had been composed of the same handful of established architects. They were creating a new single, anonymous jury seat for the express purpose of injecting a fresh, disruptive, and intellectually rigorous perspective into the selection process. A number of academics and critics had nominated me. My work on the St. Jude's Chapel and my essays on the kintsugi method were cited specifically. They wanted to know if I would accept the position for the upcoming cycle. I read the email 3 times. My hands were shaking. I thought about Autumn. She submitted a project for the Sterling Arch every single year, like a religious ritual. It was the one prize that had always eluded her. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost suffocating. To be given the power to judge the woman who had judged me unworthy. It felt like something out of a Greek tragedy, a quiet, cosmic joke. I walked to my window and looked out at the city skyline. I could just see the top of the Athelgard Tower, its double helix facade catching the afternoon light. My tower, my stolen masterpiece. My decision was instantaneous. It wasn't about revenge. I repeated the mantra, but this time it sounded a little less convincing in my own head. This was about something else. It was about balance. It was about closing a circle. It was about the simple, undeniable fact that architects should be judged on the quality of their work, not the quality of their sales pitch. I sat back down at my desk, my heart a steady rhythmic drum. I typed my reply. Dear Sterling Arch Foundation, I would be honored to accept. Sincerely, Julia. The stage was set. The trap, if you could call it that, was laid. But it was a trap of her own making. All I had to do was wait for her to walk into it. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that she would. Autumn Vance could no more resist the lure of a major award than a moth could resist a flame. And so we arrive at the present moment. Me, in my quiet, sunlit office, the heavy, glossy proposal for the Helios spire lying open on my desk. The name itself is a testament to Autumn's ego, a spire named after her own firm. It's a skyscraper, intended to be her magnum opus, the project that would finally clinch the sterling arch and solidify her legacy. The renderings are breathtaking, all sleek lines and impossible glass curves, shimmering against a perfect digital sunset. It's designed to impress, to awe, to overwhelm. But I'm not a client, I'm an architect, and I can see the truth behind the polish. I spent the first hour just looking. I didn't read her overconfident, jargon-filled mission statement. I didn't look at the budget, which I knew would be astronomical. I just looked at the design itself, the blueprints, the structural plans, the material specifications, and a slow, familiar disappointment settled over me. It was like listening to a cover band play a song I had written. They knew the words, but they didn't understand the music. The Helios spire was a Frankenstein's monster of my old ideas. I could see echoes of my work everywhere. The aerodynamic profile was a clumsy imitation of the Ethelgard Tower. The internal atrium was a watered-down version of my Moreau Center concept. It was a collection of my greatest hits, remixed by someone with a tin ear. She had taken the skin of my work, but she had missed the soul. The kintsugi method was about honesty, about making the structure's logic visible. This design was all about concealment. It used ridiculously expensive, custom-fabricated materials to hide awkward joints. It relied on a massive, energy-guzzling internal steel skeleton to hold up a facade that was inherently unstable. It was a lie, told in glass and steel. It was a building with the skin of a lion but the bones of a mouse. My first move was to pick up my red pen. For the next 8 hours, I didn't write a critique. I conducted a vivisection. My notes weren't emotional, they were clinical, precise, and utterly unsparing. I circled every point of structural weakness. I questioned the flawed wind load calculations. I highlighted the absurdly inefficient energy consumption that made a mockery of its sustainable branding. I filled the margins with questions, pointed, technical questions that I knew Autumn couldn't answer. Questions like, please provide the dynamic load analysis for the spire's resonance frequency, as the current model seems to ignore the Venturi effect created by the adjacent buildings. And the proposed cladding system relies on a new polymer composite. What is its long-term performance data regarding UV degradation and thermal exposure? The manufacturer's own white paper suggests it's untested beyond 5 years. I was using the language of our profession as a scalpel. I was dismantling her masterpiece not on the basis of taste, but on the basis of competence. The final part of my review was the most brutal. I quoted the opening paragraph from her own proposal, a florid piece of prose about how architecture must be an honest dialogue between form and function. Then I wrote, this proposal fails to meet its own stated objective. The form is a dishonest marketing exercise, and its function is compromised by a fundamental lack of structural integrity. It is not architecture, it is scenery, and scenery, no matter how beautiful, eventually falls down. I submitted my juror's critique into the anonymous online portal. I didn't sign it, I didn't need to. My critique was my signature. It was a quiet digital bomb, and I had just lit the fuse. 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed. It was Leo. I answered, my heart giving a little lurch. His voice was a hushed, frantic whisper. Julia, you are not going to believe this. The preliminary jury feedback came in. They send it to the finalists to give them a chance to respond to any critiques before the final vote. He paused, and I could hear him take a deep breath. Someone on that jury tore the Helios spire to pieces. Not like, I don't like it, like they took it apart screw by screw. The questions they're asking, no one here knows how to answer them. I kept my voice calm. What was Autumn's reaction? A disaster, he said. I've never seen her like this. She held an all-hands meeting. She was white as a sheet. She projected the anonymous critique onto the main screen for everyone to see. She read it aloud, her voice getting shakier with every sentence. She kept saying, who is this? Who hates me this much? She thinks it's a personal attack from a rival firm. She's accusing everyone of incompetence, of failing her. She looked at the head engineer, a guy who's been doing this for 30 years, and asked him to explain the resonance frequencies thing, and he just stammered, because he hadn't thought of it either. The whole office is in a panic. The noise, as you used to call it, is at a fever pitch. I closed my eyes, a slow, cold satisfaction spreading through me. The silent takeover had begun. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a single phone call. I had simply held her work, and my work up to the light. And the light had revealed the truth. She thinks it's a personal attack, Leo had said. The irony was, she was half right. It wasn't an attack from a rival firm. It was far more personal than that. It was the ghost from the machine, finally speaking up. And it was speaking in a language that only a true architect could understand. A language of truth, of gravity, and of the inevitable collapse of dishonest structures. She had built her career on my foundations. Now I was simply pointing out the cracks, and the entire building was starting to tremble. The fallout from my anonymous critique was faster and more catastrophic than I could have ever imagined. The Sterling Arch jury process is famously, almost sacredly, confidential, but the world of high-stakes architecture, and the finance that fuels it, is a surprisingly small gossipy village. The preliminary feedback, intended only for the finalists, began to leak. The first tremor hit a week after my call with Leo. He messaged me with a single sentence. Vectra Capital pulled out. Vectra Capital was the primary investment group behind the Helios Spire. A notoriously cautious, data-driven fund. They weren't gamblers, they were undertakers. They only bet on sure things. According to Leo, a summary of the jury's technical concerns had somehow found its way to their board. An anonymous, devastating report questioning the fundamental viability of their $100 million investment was not something they could ignore. They didn't just pull out, they vanished. Calls from Autumn went unreturned. Emails bounced back. The money was gone. The power shift had begun, and it was seismic. The very next day, I received an email. The sender was a senior partner at a boutique investment firm, a competitor of Vectra's. The subject line was a different kind of spire. The email was brief. He said he'd been following my work since the St. Jude's Chapel piece. He mentioned he was looking for a new flagship project, something with integrity and a real story. He said he'd been in talks with another firm, but had recently developed reservations. He wanted to know if Axis Mundi Design was taking on new clients. I stared at the email. It was him, the ex-Helios investor. He didn't say it, but I knew. He had seen the critique, seen the weakness in Autumn's proposal, and was now actively seeking out the very philosophy that her project lacked. He was looking for honest architecture. He was looking for me. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was about the natural migration of capital from a weak idea to a strong one. It was just business, but it felt like justice. Meanwhile, Autumn was in a full-blown panic. With her funding gone and her project on life support, she did exactly what a cornered narcissist does. She went on the attack. She stopped trying to answer the critique and started trying to discredit the source. She couldn't possibly know for sure that it was me. It was a logical leap driven by paranoia, but she must have put the pieces together. My public work on the Kintsugi method, my connection to Marcus Thorne, my sudden visibility in the academic journals the jury members read. She made her desperate countermove. She called the president of the Sterling Arch Foundation directly. Leo heard the story from one of the partners at his firm, who was friends with someone on the foundation's board. Autumn, in a voice dripping with manufactured concern, claimed to have discovered a grave conflict of interest on the jury. She accused an unnamed juror of professional sabotage, citing a bitter history with a former employee. She demanded that the juror be identified and removed, and that her project be re-evaluated by an impartial panel. It backfired in the most spectacular way possible. The Sterling Arch Foundation guards its integrity like a national treasure. The accusation that they could be manipulated by a bitter ex-employee was a direct assault on their honor. The president of the foundation, a stern, old-school architect of immense repute, was deeply insulted. He told Autumn, in no uncertain terms, that the jury's critiques were based on the architectural merits of the submissions alone, and that her unsubstantiated, unprofessional accusations were noted. He didn't just reject her claim, he essentially hung up on her. The story of her desperate, flailing phone call was all over the industry within hours. She hadn't just lost her funding, she was losing her reputation. She no longer looked like a star architect, she looked like a sore loser. The final jury meeting was a formality. It was conducted via a secure video call. The other jurors, all giants of the industry, were there. Names I had studied in school. I remained anonymous, my camera off, my name listed only as juror #7. When the Helios Spire came up for the final vote, there was a long, awkward silence. The jury chair, the same man Autumn had insulted, cleared his throat. Given the unresolved technical queries and the subsequent withdrawal of its primary funding, he said, his voice dry as dust, I believe we can move this submission out of final consideration. Are there any objections? Silence. No one wanted to touch it. It was now radioactive. My second move was to say nothing at all. I didn't have to. My critique had been a virus, and it had done its work. The system was now purging the infection on its own. With a simple click, the Helios spire was removed from the digital shortlist. Just like that, it was over. Autumn's dream, her magnum opus, was dead. It didn't die in a blaze of glory, but in the sterile silence of a procedural vote. It was a quiet, bureaucratic execution, and I was the one who had, with a few carefully chosen words, signed the death warrant. The power had not just shifted, it had been completely transferred. She had held the power of employment over me, the power of her name, her polish, but I had discovered a much greater power, the power of quiet competence, the power of the truth, and in the world of architecture, as in the world of physics, truth, like gravity, always wins. The announcement of the Sterling Arch shortlist landed like a bomb in the quiet, manicured world of architecture. Every major trade publication ran the story, and the biggest story wasn't who was on the list, but who was off it. The absence of Autumn Vance and the Helios spire was a deafening silence. For a star of her magnitude, with a project of that scale and budget, to not even make the final cut was more than a failure. It was a public humiliation. The narrative she had so carefully constructed around herself, the myth of the infallible visionary, shattered overnight. The quiet buzz in the industry became a roar. Why was it dropped? What did the jury see? The rumor mill, already primed by the stories of her financial woes and her frantic call to the foundation, went into overdrive. My vindication didn't come from a dramatic public reveal. I remained anonymous. The beauty of my plan, if you can call it that, was that my fingerprints were nowhere near the scene of the crime. The system had simply done its job. It had evaluated a piece of work and found it wanting. The consequences were all Autumn's. I knew a confrontation was inevitable. I just didn't know when or where it would happen. It came a week later. I was at a small gallery opening for a photographer friend. It was a low-key event, wine in plastic cups, a crowd of artists and designers. I was talking to Marcus Thorne by a large abstract photograph of rusted metal, and then I felt it, a change in the room's atmosphere, a sudden pocket of cold. I turned, and there she was. Autumn was standing a few feet away, holding a glass of red wine. She looked diminished. Her usual impeccable tailoring seemed to hang off her slightly. Her face, stripped of its usual confident glow, looked tired and brittle. She was staring at me, her eyes burning with a cold fire. She walked towards me, her steps unnervingly silent. Marcus, ever the gentleman, saw the look on her face and discreetly melted into the crowd. She stopped in front of me, so close I could smell the wine on her breath. Her voice was a venomous whisper, meant for my ears only. You, she hissed. It was you. You couldn't stand to see me succeed, so you hid in the shadows and stabbed me in the back. You ruined me. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. In my fantasies, I would read her a list of her crimes, of my stolen work, of my pain, but standing there, looking at the wreckage of this woman, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger was gone, replaced by a kind of clinical pity. It wasn't about revenge. It was about standards. I didn't raise my voice. I took a sip of my cheap plastic cup of wine and met her gaze. My response was quiet, precise. It wasn't about you, Autumn. It was about the architecture, and the architecture wasn't good enough. You once told me I lacked polish. It turns out your work lacks a foundation. Her face contorted, a mask of fury and disbelief. She looked like she wanted to throw her wine on me, to scream, to cause a scene, but she didn't. Something in my quiet certainty seemed to break her. The fight went out of her eyes, replaced by a hollow, defeated look. She saw the truth. She saw that I wasn't the bitter, vengeful underling she wanted me to be. I was the juror who had made a professional judgment, and that was so much worse. I held her gaze for a moment longer, then I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and walked away. I didn't look back. I left her there, alone in the middle of a crowded room, a star that had collapsed into a black hole. Checkmate. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place 2 weeks later. An official press release from Helios Design circulated to the entire industry. Autumn Vance, it read, is stepping down from her role as senior partner to pursue new creative opportunities. Everyone knew what that meant. she'd been forced out. The partners, faced with a collapsed flagship project, a damaged reputation, and an exodus of clients, had cut their losses. Autumn Vance, the brand, was no longer profitable. That afternoon, Leo called me. His voice was bright, excited. "It's done," he said. "She's gone. The partners are restructuring. A few of us, the ones who you mentored, were all leaving." We were wondering, is Axis Mundi Design hiring? I looked around my office. It was no longer a spare bedroom. A year of hard work, culminating in the contract with the ex-Helios investor, had allowed me to lease a beautiful, open-plan studio space in a renovated warehouse district. It was still mostly empty, filled with potential. It was a foundation, waiting for a structure to be built upon it. "Yes, Leo," I said, a smile spreading across my face for the first time in what felt like years. "Yes, we are." My new reality began to take shape. My once lonely studio was now filled with the low hum of computers, the scratch of pencils on paper, and the energetic buzz of collaboration. Leo and 3 other brilliant young architects from Helios had joined me. They weren't just employees, they were partners in building something new, something honest. On the wall of my office, I unrolled the blueprints for our new project, the one that had risen from the ashes of the Helios spire. It was a complex, beautiful, and deeply honest building. It didn't hide its flaws, it celebrated them. It was a testament to the Kintsugi method. It was a testament to me, and this time, my name and mine alone was in the title block. My name is Julia, and for the first time, it felt like the whole world could hear me. The vindication wasn't in autumn's fall. It was in my own quiet, steady rise. I had not only reclaimed my past, I had built my own future, and the foundation was solid. Today I'm sitting in my office, the real one, the one with my name on the door. The afternoon light streams in, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. It's a quiet, peaceful space, but it's alive with the energy of creation. On the far wall, there's a single large framed object. It's not an award, it's not a magazine cover, and it's certainly not some insulting message I kept for motivation. It's a cocktail napkin. It's old, slightly faded, the ink a little blurred. On it is a frantic, almost illegible sketch of a twisting, impossible tower. The first seed of the Athelgard Tower, my idea, pure, uncorrupted, and now finally reclaimed. It's there to remind me, not of what was stolen, but of where the real value comes from. It comes from the spark. Everything else is just construction. I've learned that the most powerful structures aren't built from steel and glass. They're built from integrity. They're built from the quiet, unglamorous work of being true to your own vision, even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. My story wasn't really about revenge. I know I keep saying that, and maybe you believe me, maybe you don't. Perhaps it's a phrase I use to convince myself that my actions were born of principle, not of pain. But in the end, the motive doesn't change the outcome. A structure built on a lie will eventually collapse, whether you push it or simply let gravity do its work. Autumn built a career on a lie. I just pointed to the faulty foundation. The rest was inevitable. I created my own firm not to destroy hers, but to create a space where talent could be nurtured, not mined. A place where "we" is not a word used to absorb the credit of others, but a genuine expression of collaboration. A place where polish is a final touch, not a substitute for substance. So now, I want to talk to you. Yes, you, the person on the other side of this screen. My name is Julia, and my story is over, but I'll bet some part of it felt familiar. If you have ever been overlooked, underestimated, or erased in a meeting room, a classroom, or even at your own family's dinner table, if you've ever been told you weren't good enough, that you lacked the right look, the right voice, the right polish, I want you to remember this. Polish is a surface treatment. It's the first thing to fade. What matters is the work. What matters is the structure underneath. What matters is the truth of what you build, whether it's a building, a business, or a life. Don't ever let anyone convince you that their facade is more valuable than your foundation. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in a room where you knew you were the most important person there, do me a favor and give this video a like. It helps to know that these stories matter. In the comments below, let me know what you would have done. Would you have been as patient? Would you have taken the high road? I want to hear it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their time is coming, that their quiet work is not in vain. And please, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so we can continue to share these stories together, because your voice, your work, and your truth deserve to be heard. Thank you for listening.